crash of Apollo Air Flight 212 into the icy waters of the Atlantic and the discovery of the lighthouse introduces the lore of the oceanic threshold of the impossible. As Jack swims through the burning wreckage toward the lone structure, the environment represents the architectural sovereignty of the hidden world. The lore suggests that the lighthouse is not a beacon of safety, but a gateway to the secret history, representing the isolationist sovereignty of Andrew Ryan. For Jack, this arrival is the lore of the descent into the abyss. He finds that the world above is a distant memory, replaced by the world below that exists in the silence of the trench. This is the lore of the bathysphere journey, where the man becomes the sacrament of the discovery, turning the Atlantic depths into a casket of the surface world. The arrival in Rapture and the first glimpse of the underwater metropolis provides the lore of the objectivist sovereignty of the Great Chain. Andrew Ryan, the founder of the city, represents the philosophical sovereignty of the individual. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the no gods or kings, only man. He built Rapture to escape the parasites of the surface, the governments and religions that he believed stifled the human spirit, representing the industrial sovereignty of the ego. This is the lore of the impossible city. It suggests that art, science, and commerce should be free from the morality of the weak. This represents the architectural sovereignty of the Art Deco. The lore of the first view of the skyline is the lore of the gilded cage, where the beauty is leaking and cracked, proving that your sovereignty is fragile, turning the city of Rapture into a sacrament of the hubris. The lore of Adam and the discovery of plasmids provides the lore of the biological sovereignty of the genetic refinement. Adam, the miracle substance derived from deep-sea slugs, represents the molecular sovereignty of the transformation. The lore suggests that the Dr. Bridget Tenenbaum discovered that Adam could rewrite the human blueprint, allowing for the manifestation of superhuman abilities, representing the scientific sovereignty of the Fontaine's futuristics. This is the lore of the flesh made fluid. It suggests that evolution can be bought from a vending machine. This represents the commercial sovereignty of the plasmid. The lore of the first injection is the lore of the burning vein. It shatters the DNA to grant the fire, proving that your sovereignty is addictive. This highlights the terrifying nature of the splicing, turning the medical pavilion into a sacrament of the mutation. The presence of the splicers and the social decay introduces the lore of the degenerate sovereignty of the genetic addiction. The citizens of Rapture, once the best and the brightest, have become splicers, monsters driven insane by the overuse of Adam, representing the psychological sovereignty of the withdrawal. Their lore suggests that beauty has been replaced by the mask, representing the sociological sovereignty of the vanity. This is the lore of the civil war of the ego. It suggests that freedom without restraint leads to the animalism. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the city. The lore of the splicer encounter is the lore of the screaming shadow. It forces the Jack to kill his fellow man for the scraps of the atom, proving that your sovereignty is survivalist. The lore of the Little Sisters and the Big Daddies provides the lore of the symbiotic sovereignty of the harvest. The Little Sisters, conditioned children who gather Adam from the dead, and the Big Daddies, armored protectors grafted into diving suits, represent the industrial sovereignty of the protection. The lore suggests that the bond between them is chemical and emotional, representing the biological sovereignty of the Suchong's research. This is the lore of the Gatherer and the Guardian. It suggests that innocence is a tool of the economy. This represents the moral sovereignty of the choice. The lore of the Big Daddy duel is the lore of the clashing of the steel. You must kill the protector to reach the source, proving that your sovereignty is predatory, turning the corridors of Rapture into a sacrament of the moral weight. The introduction of Atlas and the voice of the resistance introduces the lore of the manipulative sovereignty of the helping hand. Atlas, the man who contacts Jack via the radio, represents the vocal sovereignty of the guidance. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the "would you kindly." He presents himself as a family man fighting against the tyranny of Ryan, representing the propaganda sovereignty of the underclass. This is the lore of the radio ghost. It suggests that trust is the only currency left in the drowning world. This represents the tactical sovereignty of the rebellion. The lore of Atlas's instructions is the lore of the obedience of the Jack. He leads the player through the hell with the promise of the escape, proving that your sovereignty is guided. For the Jack of the opening era, the world is the testing of the sensory resolve. You realize that the world is beautifully rotten. The lore suggests that Jack is the stranger in the sunken garden. You are the only mind that sees the madness without the history of the splicing. The medical pavilion is not a clinic, it is a mechanical butcher shop that you must navigate with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the gathering of the atom so visceral. You are changing your body to save your life. You look at the glass walls, knowing that they are the only barriers that the ocean has left to crush the hubris. The Golden Age is a neon sign in the dark, and you are the only will left to signal the end of the Ryan's dream. As this first segment of the history concludes, Jack stands at the threshold of the Neptune's bounty, the water beginning to seep through the gaskets. Behind lies the descent into the abyss and the discovery of the atom. Before stands the war with Peach Wilkins and the shadow of the Frank Fontaine. The air is no longer tense with the crash, but heavy with the smell of the sea salt and the spliced blood. You have seen the sovereignty of the great chain, the mutation of the flesh, and the symbiosis of the metal. The lore of Bioshock has shifted from the arrival to the sovereignty of the adaptation. You realize that the Rapture is hungry. You look at the leaking ceiling, knowing that you are finally the only reclaimer of the gene. The Golden Age is a city of the salt, and you are the only hand left to shatter the glass of the Andrew Ryan. The descent into Neptune's bounty and the exploration of the city's industrial wharf introduces the lore of the mercenary sovereignty of the smuggler's wharf. As Jack enters the fishing and processing district, the environment transitions from the sterile medical facade to the rotting industrial underbelly, representing the economic sovereignty of the black market. The lore suggests that Neptune's bounty was the illegal heart of Rapture, where the rules of the great chain were bent to accommodate the human greed, representing the cynical sovereignty of the commerce. For Jack, this mission is the lore of the hunter in the fish house. He finds that the working class of Rapture has been grounded into the silt by the high prices of the atom. This is the lore of the wharf of the sin, where the soldier must navigate the ice to expose the secret, turning the wharf corridors into a sacrament of the smuggling. The smuggling empire of Frank Fontaine provides the lore of the sociopathic sovereignty of the con artist. Fontaine, the rival of Andrew Ryan and the king of the underworld, represents the pragmatic sovereignty of the shadow. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the long game. He did not build Rapture with philosophy, but with theft and manipulation, using the Fontaine charities to recruit the poor as his private army, representing the deceptive sovereignty of the altruism. This is the lore of the wolf in the sheep's clothing. It suggests that Ryan's dream was the Fontaine's opportunity. This represents the capitalist sovereignty of the fraud. The lore of the Fontaine's legacy is the lore of the invisible hand, where the charity is a weapon, proving that your sovereignty is manipulated, turning the smuggler's hideout into a sacrament of the treachery. The first choice, harvest or save, provides the lore of the moral sovereignty of the genetic compassion. Confronting the first little sister outside the harvest room, Jack is presented with the choice by Tenenbaum and Atlas, representing the ethical sovereignty of the reclaimer. The lore suggests that harvesting provides immediate power at the cost of innocence, while saving provides long-term hope and gifts, representing the biological sovereignty of the redemption. This is the lore of the fork in the DNA. It suggests that Jack is the only moral agent left in a world of the predation. This represents the philosophical sovereignty of the free will. The lore of the first rescue is the lore of the gentle touch. It resets the genetic clock for the child, proving that your sovereignty is empathetic, turning the harvest vent into a sacrament of the humanity. The duel with Peach Wilkins provides the lore of the paranoid sovereignty of the wharf rat. Wilkins, a former associate of Fontaine who has hidden himself in the freezer of the wharf, represents the mental sovereignty of the isolation. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the fear. He believes that everyone is a spy for Ryan or a ghost of Fontaine, representing the psychological sovereignty of the splicing. This is the lore of the frozen grudge. It suggests that time in the ice has hardened the hatred. This represents the biological sovereignty of the frost. The lore of the Wilkins fight is the lore of the shattered glass. You must use the fire to melt the defiance, proving that your sovereignty is decisive. This highlights the claustrophobic nature of the wharf, turning the freezer room into a sacrament of the cold death. The lore of the spider splicers and the ceiling stalkers provides the lore of the vertical sovereignty of the mutation. The introduction of these highly mobile enemies, who utilize wall crawling and ambush tactics, represents the predatory sovereignty of the evolution. Their lore suggests that the wharf workers used Adam to adapt to the narrow pipes, representing the industrial sovereignty of the labor. This is the lore of the hook in the dark. It suggests that nowhere is safe in the sunken city. This represents the biological sovereignty of the arachnid. The lore of the spider encounter is the lore of the war of the ceiling. It forces the Jack to look up to find the threat, proving that your sovereignty is perceptive. This highlights the terrifying mobility of the addiction, turning the warehouse rafters into a sacrament of the vertigo. The presence of the research camera and the observation of the enemy introduces the lore of the analytical sovereignty of the voyeur. Using the camera provided by Peachy to study the splicer, the lore reveals the weaknesses of the flesh, representing the scientific sovereignty of the knowledge. The lore suggests that understanding the monster is the only way to kill the monster, representing the biological sovereignty of the observation. This is the lore of the eye of the creator. It suggests that Jack is a scientist of the slaughter. This represents the technical sovereignty of the progress. The lore of the research data is the lore of the pattern of the madness. It grants the power through the study of the pain, proving that your sovereignty is intellectual, turning the combat photography into a sacrament of the discovery. For the Jack of the Neptune's era, the world is the testing of the moral resolve. You realize that the world is built on the lies of the great men. The lore suggests that Jack is the light in the smuggler's tunnel. You are the only mind that sees the Frank Fontaine through the mist of the history. The wharf is not a market. It is a mechanical grave of the ethics that you must exhume with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the saving of the little sister so quiet. You are breaking the cycle to save the soul. You look at the frozen bodies, knowing that they are the only sculptures that the Ryan has left to decorate the industry. The golden age is a spark of the incinerate, and you are the only will left to thaw the heart of the rapture. As the second segment of the history concludes, Jack stands at the entrance to the smuggler's hideout, the submarine of Atlas waiting in the darkness. Behind lies the wharf of the sin and the empire of the con artist. Before stands the destruction of the submarine and the shadow of the Arcadia. The air is no longer tense with the ice, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the imminent loss. You have seen the sovereignty of the black market, the choice of the redemption, and the mutation of the ceiling. The lore of Bioshock has shifted from the sovereignty of the adaptation to the sovereignty of the betrayal. You realize that the Ryan is watching. You look at the submarine hatch, knowing that you are finally the only passenger of the fate. The golden age is a red light on the water, and you are the only hand left to witness the death of the Atlas's hope. The entrance into Arcadia and the discovery of the city's massive hydroponic forests introduces the lore of the botanical sovereignty of the artificial breath. As Jack steps into the lush, oxygen-rich gardens, the environment represents the ecological sovereignty of the enclosed world. The lore suggests that Arcadia is the lungs of Rapture, the only place where nature is allowed to exist in a city made of steel and glass, representing the biological sovereignty of the Andrew Ryan. For Jack, this mission is the lore of the poisoned Eden. He finds that even the trees are proprietary, owned and maintained to ensure the survival of the elite, representing the capitalist sovereignty of the atmosphere. This is the lore of the Garden of the Silt, where the man must protect the leaf to secure the air, turning the forest paths into a sacrament of the photosynthesis. The oxygen crisis of the city provides the lore of the environmental sovereignty of the suffocation. When Ryan initiates the defoliant protocol to kill the trees and starve the city of air, it represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the resource denial. The lore suggests that Ryan would rather choke the world than lose the world, representing the nihilistic sovereignty of the control. This is the lore of the gasping republic. It suggests that life is a privilege granted by the founder. This represents the political sovereignty of the oxygen. The lore of the wilting forest is the lore of the gray horizon, where the greenery is a target, proving that your sovereignty is respiratory, turning the hydroponic chambers into a sacrament of the asphyxiation. The madness of Dr. Julie Langford provides the lore of the scientific sovereignty of the obsessive creation. Langford, the lead botanist of Rapture, represents the intellectual sovereignty of the naturalist. Her lore is defined by the sovereignty of the growth. She loves her trees more than the people, using Adam to create saturnine cultists and aggressive flora, representing the misanthropic sovereignty of the research. This is the lore of the mother of the woods. It suggests that science has outgrown the ethics. This represents the academic sovereignty of the isolation. The lore of the Langford's death is the lore of the final signature. By writing the code to the Lazarus vector on the window as she dies, she proves that her sovereignty is intellectual and defiant, turning the botanical office into a sacrament of the last breath. The lore of the Saturnine cult provides the lore of the primitive sovereignty of the pagan splicing. The introduction of these splicers, who wear leaf masks and worship the trees, represents the spiritual sovereignty of the genetic regression. Their lore suggests that the advanced society of Rapture has devolved into blood sacrifices and nature worship under the influence of Adam, representing the theological sovereignty of the madness. This is the lore of the forest shadow. It suggests that religion is the final symptom of the addiction. This represents the sociological sovereignty of the cult. The lore of the Saturnine encounter is the lore of the ritual in the vines. It forces the Jack to fight the supernatural in a mechanical city, proving that your sovereignty is sanity-based. The presence of the Lazarus vector and the rebirth of the forest introduces the lore of the chemical sovereignty of the resurrection. Using the formula left by Langford to reverse the defoliant, the lore reveals the power of the restoration, representing the technological sovereignty of the alchemist. The lore suggests that life can be rebooted through the proper application of the chemicals, representing the scientific sovereignty of the recovery. This is the lore of the breath of the god. It suggests that Jack is the gardener of the apocalypse. This represents the environmental sovereignty of the solution. The lore of the vector activation is the lore of the green wave. It restores the air while freezing the hope, proving that your sovereignty is essential, turning the mist-spraying system into a sacrament of the vitality. The lore of the Houdini splicer and the mastery of the illusion provides the lore of the metaphysical sovereignty of the genetic mastery. The introduction of enemies who can teleport and manipulate the light represents the optical sovereignty of the plasmid. Their lore suggests that the stage performers and magicians of Rapture used Adam to make the magic real, representing the theatrical sovereignty of the vanity. This is the lore of the ghost of the stage. It suggests that reality is fluid in the sunken city. This represents the perceptual sovereignty of the splicing. The lore of the Houdini encounter is the lore of the war of the perception. It forces the Jack to track the spark to find the man, proving that your sovereignty is attentive, turning the theater district into a sacrament of the mirage. For the Jack of the Arcadia era, the world is the testing of the environmental resolve. You realize that the world is trying to suffocate the truth. The lore suggests that Jack is the winter that brings the spring. You are the only mind that understands the language of the Langford through the smoke of the fire. The forest is not a park, it is a mechanical lung that you must heal with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the mixing of the vector so urgent. You are saving the breath to reach the Ryan. You look at the brown leaves, knowing that they are the only casualties that the Ryan has left to proclaim his power. The golden age is a gasp of the fresh air, and you are the only will left to oxygenate the rebellion of the Atlas. As this third segment of the history concludes, Jack stands at the exit of the farmer's market, the vector flowing through the pipes. Behind lies the poisoned Eden and the madness of the scientist. Before stands the artistry of Sander Cohen and the macabre beauty of the Fort Frolic. The air is no longer tense with the suffocation, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the imminent performance. You have seen the sovereignty of the artificial breath, the resurrection of the forest, and the illusion of the Houdini. The lore of Bioshock has shifted from the sovereignty of the betrayal to the sovereignty of the macabre. You realize that the Ryan is impressed. You look at the bathysphere station, knowing that you are finally the only audience of the masterpiece. The golden age is a rose in the silt, and you are the only hand left to applaud the death of the Fort Frolic. The entrance into Fort Frolic and the transition from the industrial necessity to the decadent entertainment introduces the lore of the aesthetic sovereignty of the artistic madness. As Jack steps into the neon-lit plazas of Rapture's cultural hub, the environment represents the theatrical sovereignty of the distorted beauty. The lore suggests that Fort Frolic was the playground of the elite, a place where the great chain was celebrated through excess and spectacle, representing the hedonistic sovereignty of the Andrew Ryan. For Jack, this mission is the lore of the prisoner of the stage. He finds that the district has been locked down by a single man's whim, turning the art into a weapon of the captivity. This is the lore of the macabre performance, where the man must complete the masterpiece to earn the key, turning the shopping malls into a sacrament of the plaster. The artistic insanity of Sander Cohen provides the lore of the narcissistic sovereignty of the creator's ego. Cohen, the artist laureate of Rapture, represents the perceptual sovereignty of the perfectionist. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the unflattered image. He has descended into a spliced delirium where he views death as the only honest expression, representing the misanthropic sovereignty of the creative genius. This is the lore of the muse of the murder. It suggests that art is dead if it does not bleed. This represents the sociological sovereignty of the decadence. The lore of the Cohen's radio contact is the lore of the director's voice. He treats the Jack as a prop in his final play, proving that your sovereignty is performative, turning the grand atrium into a sacrament of the stage fright. The creation of the Quatic provides the lore of the commemorative sovereignty of the assassination. To appease Cohen, Jack must hunt down and photograph the four disciples who betrayed the artist, representing the ritualistic sovereignty of the vengeance. The lore suggests that Kyle Fitzpatrick, Silas Cobb, Martin Finnegan, and Hector Schwann are the four pillars of the failure, and their post-mortem portraits are the only way to complete the gallery, representing the bureaucratic sovereignty of the death. This is the lore of the frame of the flesh. It suggests that identity is fixed only when it is silent. This represents the biographical sovereignty of the plaster. The lore of the Quatic completion is the lore of the unveiling. It appeases the monster to open the path, proving that your sovereignty is collaborative and dark. The lore of the plastered splicers and the living statues provides the lore of the petrified sovereignty of the cosmetic preservation. Throughout Fort Frolic, the presence of statues that bleed and move, when the player's back is turned, represents the paranoid sovereignty of the art. Their lore suggests that Cohen plastered the citizens alive to keep them beautiful forever, representing the industrial sovereignty of the vanity. This is the lore of the still life. It suggests that movement is a betrayal of the form. This represents the biological sovereignty of the stasis. The lore of the living statue encounter is the lore of the jump scare of the history. It forces the Jack to fear the inanimate, proving that your sovereignty is vulnerable to the frozen, turning the art galleries into a sacrament of the rigor mortis. The lore of the power to the people stations provides the lore of the mechanical sovereignty of the personal empowerment. The introduction of these weapon upgrade stations within the luxury shops represents the industrial sovereignty of the self-defense. The lore suggests that Ryan encouraged the arming of the citizenry as a form of the independence, representing the commercial sovereignty of the violence. This is the lore of the custom kill. It suggests that technology is the only equalizer in the sunken world. This represents the technical sovereignty of the upgrades. The lore of the station activation is the lore of the steel refinement. It hardens the jack for the final duel, proving that your sovereignty is aggressive, turning the tobacco shops into a sacrament of the ballistics. The presence of the Fleet Hall and the musical despair introduces the lore of the auditory sovereignty of the dying echo. As Jack explores the music halls and record stores, the lore reveals the soundtrack of the collapse, representing the cultural sovereignty of the nostalgia. The lore suggests that Rapture's music was sublime before it was spliced, representing the aesthetic sovereignty of the loss. This is the lore of the broken needle. It suggests that harmony is impossible in the city of the screams. This represents the sociological sovereignty of the discord. The lore of the Fleet Hall performance is the lore of the waltz of the dead. It drowns the violence in the classical beauty, proving that your sovereignty is poetic, turning the concert stage into a sacrament of the melancholy, where the enemy is dying in the key of C. For the Jack of the Fort Frolic era, the world is the testing of the aesthetic resolve. You realize that the world is being controlled by the madman's vision. The lore suggests that Jack is the canvas of the slaughter. You are the only mind that sees the Cohen as a broken record through the gold of the theater. The fort is not a district. It is a mechanical gallery of the ego that you must curate with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the taking of the photograph so disturbing. You are becoming the assistant to kill the boss. You look at the neon lights, knowing that they are the only eyes that the Ryan has left to judge the performance. The golden age is a burst of the camera flash, and you are the only will left to develop the truth of the rapture. As this fourth segment of the history concludes, Jack stands at the center of the Quatic, the Cohen descending the stairs to bless the work. Behind lies the theatrical sovereignty of the madness and the creation of the statues. Before stands the siege of the Hephaestus and the final meeting with Andrew Ryan. The air is no longer tense with the performance, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the imminent confrontation. You have seen the sovereignty of the artistic ego, the masterpiece of the flesh, and the melancholy of the music. The lore of Bioshock has shifted from the sovereignty of the macabre to the sovereignty of the confrontation. You realize that the Ryan is waiting. You look at the elevator to the core, knowing that you are finally the only critic of the Empire. The Golden Age is a curtain call in the dark, and you are the only hand left to end the show of the Andrew Ryan. The entrance into Hephaestus and the descent into the geothermal core of the city introduces the lore of the industrial sovereignty of the geothermal heart. As Jack enters the massive power plant that sustains the underwater world, the environment represents the mechanical sovereignty of the survival. The lore suggests that Hephaestus is the basement of the dream, a place of heat, pressure, and unyielding steel where the great chain is physically forged, representing the labor sovereignty of the Andrew Ryan. For Jack, this mission is the lore of the saboteur of the core. He finds that the power is not just electrical, but the literal lifeblood of the city that Ryan is prepared to overload to prevent it from falling into the hands of the parasites. This is the lore of the heat of the ego, where the man must stoke the fire to reach the creator, turning the engine rooms into a sacrament of the steam. The final walk to Andrew Ryan's office provides the lore of the existential sovereignty of the architect's end. Ryan, barricaded within his sanctuary at the center of the core, represents the philosophical sovereignty of the self-determination. His lore is defined by the sovereignty of the choice over the force. He has realized that Rapture is a failure, but he refuses to let the slave, Jack, claim the victory without understanding the nature of his own bondage, representing the autocratic sovereignty of the father. This is the lore of the end of the chain. It suggests that control is an illusion if the will is not your own. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the founder. The lore of the Ryan's office is the lore of the philosophical execution, where the God becomes the sacrament of the truth, proving that your sovereignty is conditioned. The lore of the great chain and the geothermal maintenance provides the lore of the logistical sovereignty of the enclosed machine. Throughout Hephaestus, the heat exchanges and steam turbines represent the invasive sovereignty of the environment. The lore suggests that the ocean is constantly trying to crush the city, and only the heat of the earth keeps the cold of the Atlantic at bay, representing the elemental sovereignty of the engineering. This is the lore of the pressure of the law. It suggests that freedom is powered by the sweat of the worker. This represents the economic sovereignty of the industry. The lore of the EMP bomb construction is the lore of the short circuit of the power. You must kill the lights to open the door, proving that your sovereignty is disruptive, turning the power grid into a sacrament of the darkness. The lore of the Suchong's laboratory and the genetic imprinting provides the lore of the biological sovereignty of the conditioned reflex. The discovery of Dr. E. Suchong's notes within the labs of Hephaestus reveals the truth of the Jack's birth, representing the molecular sovereignty of the slave. The lore suggests that Jack was grown and accelerated to serve as a tool of the Fontaine, representing the scientific sovereignty of the manipulation. This is the lore of the man-made child. It suggests that nature can be overwritten by the trigger phrase. This represents the psychological sovereignty of the control. The lore of the Suchong's death is the lore of the Guardian's irony. By being killed by his own creation, a big daddy, Suchong proves that his sovereignty was flawed, turning the laboratory into a sacrament of the karma. The presence of the trophy wall and the victims of the Ryan introduces the lore of the brutal sovereignty of the political purge. As Jack approaches the office, the sight of Ryan's enemies, mounted on the wall like hunting trophies, represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the intimidation. The lore suggests that Ryan used violence to cleanse the chain of any links that did not pull in his direction, representing the sociological sovereignty of the state. This is the lore of the Gallery of the Silence. It suggests that disagreement is a capital crime in the sunken utopia. This represents the bureaucratic sovereignty of the death. The lore of the trophy observation is the lore of the warning of the father. It prepares the Jack for the final confrontation, proving that your sovereignty is predetermined. The lore of the circuit breakers and the overload sequence provides the lore of the destructive sovereignty of the scorched earth. Ryan's attempt to blow the core to erase the evidence of his failure represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the defiance. The lore suggests that Ryan would rather die with the city than see the parasite rule the city, representing the apocalyptic sovereignty of the ego. This is the lore of the final resistor. It suggests that power is dangerous in the hands of the desperate. This represents the industrial sovereignty of the meltdown. The lore of the breaker reset is the lore of the hand on the lever. It forces the Jack to save the city to kill the man, proving that your sovereignty is paradoxical, turning the core control into a sacrament of the imminent doom. For the Jack of the Hephaestus era, the world is the testing of the autonomous resolve. You realize that the world is being controlled by the voice in your head. The lore suggests that Jack is the puppet of the history. You are the only mind that sees the trigger through the steam of the core. The power plant is not a facility, it is a mechanical guillotine that you must trigger with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the walking to the office so involuntary. You are following the command to kill the creator. You look at the geothermal heat, knowing that it is the only fire that the Ryan has left to purify the vision. The golden age is a glimmer of the golf club, and you are the only will left to strike the final note of the Andrew Ryan. As this fifth segment of the history concludes, Jack stands at the door of the Andrew Ryan, the would you kindly echoing in his brain. Behind lies the power core of the city and the truth of the conditioned reflex. Before stands the death of the founder and the rise of the Frank Fontaine. The air is no longer tense with the heat, but cold with the certainty of the predestination. You have seen the sovereignty of the industrial heart, the slave sovereignty of the imprinting, and the nihilistic sovereignty of the end. The lore of Bioshock has shifted from the sovereignty of the confrontation to the sovereignty of the revelation. You realize that the chain is real. You look at the threshold, knowing that you are finally the only trigger of the fate. The golden age is a blood on the carpet, and you are the only hand left to kill the god of the rapture. The confrontation in Andrew Ryan's inner sanctum and the subsequent shattering of the protagonist's agency introduces the lore of the psychological sovereignty of the trigger phrase. As Jack stands before the man who built Rapture, the environment represents the philosophical sovereignty of the revealed truth. The lore suggests that the golf club is not just a weapon, but a metaphor for the choice, representing the existential sovereignty of the Andrew Ryan. Ryan reveals that Jack is not a survivor of a plane crash, but a genetic tool grown in a lab and conditioned with the phrase, "Would you kindly?" representing the molecular sovereignty of the slavery. For Jack, this moment is the lore of the death of the self. He finds that every action he took was a command masquerading as a choice. This is the lore of the obedient slave, where the man must kill his father because he has no will to refuse, turning the office floor into a sacrament of the predestination. The reveal of the "would you kindly" provides the lore of the linguistic sovereignty of the subconscious control. This phrase, implanted by Dr. Suchong, represents the cognitive sovereignty of the conditioning. The lore suggests that the human brain can be hacked as easily as a turret, provided the key is known, representing the neurological sovereignty of the fontaine. This is the lore of the invisible leash. It suggests that freedom is a story we tell ourselves while we follow the map. This represents the cynical sovereignty of the manipulation. The lore of the mental breach is the lore of the echo in the skull, where the voice is the master, proving that your sovereignty is synthesized, turning the protagonist's mind into a sacrament of the programming. The betrayal of Atlas provides the lore of the sociopathic sovereignty of the false identity. Once Ryan is dead and the keys to the city are secured, Atlas drops his Irish accent and reveals himself as Frank Fontaine, representing the deceptive sovereignty of the underworld. The lore suggests that Atlas was a construct of the propaganda, designed to make Jack feel like a hero while he acted as an assassin, representing the theatrical sovereignty of the fraud. This is the lore of the wolf unmasked. It suggests that Charity was the bait and Jack was the hook. This represents the strategic sovereignty of the fontaine. The lore of the Atlas reveal is the lore of the laughter of the predator. It mocks the player for their trust, proving that your sovereignty is exploited, turning the radio comms into a sacrament of the isolation. The ascension of Frank Fontaine introduces the lore of the monstrous sovereignty of the total atom integration. With Ryan out of the way, Fontaine moves to seize control of the city's remaining resources, representing the capitalist sovereignty of the monopolist. The lore suggests that Fontaine does not want to lead Rapture, but to consume it, using the atom to become a genetic god, representing the industrial sovereignty of the consumption. This is the lore of the beast of the Atlantic. It suggests that power is vast and ugly when it is concentrated in the one. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the greed. The lore of the Fontaine takeover is the lore of the new tyranny. It replaces the ideology with the appetite, proving that your sovereignty is hunted, turning the city's infrastructure into a sacrament of the predation. The lore of the mental resistance and Tenenbaum's intervention provides the lore of the compassionate sovereignty of the genetic redemption. As Fontaine attempts to kill Jack by stopping his heart with a remote command, Dr. Tenenbaum intervenes to break the conditioning, representing the medical sovereignty of the remorse. The lore suggests that Tenenbaum seeks to undo the evil she helped to create, representing the scientific sovereignty of the penance. This is the lore of the second birth. It suggests that choice can be restored through the proper application of the antidote. This represents the biological sovereignty of the autonomy. The lore of the conditioning break is the lore of the silence of the voice. It grants the Jack the first true breath of his life, proving that your sovereignty is recoverable. The presence of the Little Sister's sanctuary introduces the lore of the protective sovereignty of the innocents. Hidden within the vents and secret rooms of the city, Tenenbaum's sanctuary represents the social sovereignty of the refuge. The lore suggests that the Little Sisters are the only pure thing left in the spliced ruin, representing the ecological sovereignty of the hope. This is the lore of the garden in the vent. It suggests that life finds a way to survive the greed of the men. This represents the moral sovereignty of the sanctuary. The lore of the sanctuary discovery is the lore of the peace in the storm. It provides the Jack with a reason to fight that is not a command, turning the hidden rooms into a sacrament of the future, where the monster is becoming the protector. For the Jack of the Revelation era, the world is the testing of the internal resolve. You realize that the world is built on the script of a dead man. The lore suggests that Jack is the broken puppet who finds his strings. You are the only mind that sees the Frank Fontaine as a parasite through the blood of the Andrew Ryan. The office is not a sanctuary. It is a mechanical stage of the betrayal that you must exit with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the realization of the slavery so chilling. You are breaking the habit to kill the boss. You look at the golf club, knowing that it is the only key that the history has left to unlock the truth. The golden age is a static on the radio, and you are the only will left to shatter the sound of the would you kindly. As the sixth segment of the history concludes, Jack stands in the vents of the Olympus Heights, the voice of the Fontaine screaming threats through the intercom. Behind lies the death of the father and the betrayal of the guide. Before stands the infiltration of the Fontaine's penthouse and the preparation for the final splicing. The air is no longer tense with the command, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the cold reality of the freedom. You have seen the sovereignty of the trigger phrase, the laughter of the predator, and the refuge of the innocents. The lore of Bioshock has shifted from the sovereignty of the revelation to the sovereignty of the autonomy. You realize that the chain is broken. You look at the antidote, knowing that you are finally the only architect of the revenge. The golden age is a heartbeat in the dark, and you are the only hand left to strangle the legacy of the Frank Fontaine. The infiltration of Olympus Heights and the ascent into the luxury penthouses of Rapture's elite introduces the lore of the decadent sovereignty of the fallen aristocracy. As Jack navigates the opulent apartment complexes of Mercury Suites, the environment represents the sociological sovereignty of the high society. The lore suggests that Olympus Heights was the Mount Olympus of the great chain, where the wealthiest citizens lived in isolation from the squalor, representing the elitist sovereignty of the Andrew Ryan. For Jack, this mission is the lore of the ghost in the penthouse. He finds that the elite were the first to splice themselves into oblivion, turning their homes into tombs of the vanity. This is the lore of the gilded ruin, where the man must loot the rich to kill the god, turning the marble hallways into a sacrament of the desecration. The sabotage of the Fontaine's heart control provides the lore of the biological sovereignty of the counterconditioning, because Fontaine still holds the frequency to stop Jack's heart. The journey through the suites of Dr. Suchong and Tenenbaum represents the medical sovereignty of the genetic duel. The lore suggests that life is a broadcast that can be jammed with the right chemical signal, representing the neurological sovereignty of the science. This is the lore of the heart stutter. It suggests that Jack is a radio that Fontaine is trying to turn off. This represents the technological sovereignty of the control. The lore of the Lot 192 antidote is the lore of the bitter cure, where the medicine is a poison that resets the system, proving that your sovereignty is fragile and synthetic, turning the apartment laboratories into a sacrament of the purgation. The lore of the Mercury Suites and the Suchong-Tenenbaum rivalry provides the lore of the professional sovereignty of the ethical divorce. Within the shared laboratory space of the city's greatest minds, the lore reveals the conflict of the soul, representing the moral sovereignty of the discovery. The lore suggests that while Suchong saw children as materials, Tenenbaum saw them as errors to be fixed, representing the psychological sovereignty of the remorse. This is the lore of the two creators. It suggests that Rapture was built by the genius and destroyed by the lack of the empathy. This represents the philosophical sovereignty of the responsibility. The lore of the Suchong Notes is the lore of the blueprint of the slave, where the father of the science is exposed as a butcher, turning the research desks into a sacrament of the sin. The infiltration of the Fontaine's penthouse introduces the lore of the imperial sovereignty of the usurper. As Jack reaches the top floor, the environment shifts to the aggressive luxury, of the man who would be king, representing the criminal sovereignty of the Frank Fontaine. The lore suggests that Fontaine's home is a fortress of the greed, filled with stolen art and high-tech security, representing the industrial sovereignty of the theft. This is the lore of the King of the Dust. It suggests that Fontaine does not value the beauty. He only values the ownership. This represents the cynical sovereignty of the capital. The lore of the penthouse breach is the lore of the end of the luxury. It shatters the illusion of the safety for the man at the top, proving that your sovereignty is invasive, turning the grand ballrooms into a sacrament of the revenge. The lore of the Big Daddy transformation initiation provides the lore of the physical sovereignty of the heavy burden. Realizing that the little sisters will only trust a protector, Jack begins the process of becoming a Big Daddy, representing the somatic sovereignty of the sacrifice. The lore suggests that to save the children, the man must give up his humanity and put on the suit, representing the biological sovereignty of the martyrdom. This is the lore of the iron skin. It suggests that armor is permanent and lethal. This represents the industrial sovereignty of the grafting. The lore of the transformation quest is the lore of the losing of the self. It forces the Jack to search for the scent and the voice box to trick the child, proving that your sovereignty is transactional, turning the changing rooms into a sacrament of the steel. The presence of the Apollo Square and the poverty of the splicers introduces the lore of the socio-political sovereignty of the starvation. As Jack passes through the proletariat districts on his way to the end, the lore reveals the cost of the Ryan's dream, representing the institutional sovereignty of the inequality. The lore suggests that Apollo Square was a ghetto for those who could not afford the splicing, representing the sociological sovereignty of the exclusion. This is the lore of the breadline of the Rapture. It suggests that objectivism has no mercy for the unlucky. This represents the political sovereignty of the despair. The lore of the square execution is the lore of the hanging of the hope. It shows the Jack the end result of the great chain, turning the public plazas into a sacrament of the failure, where the hero is walking through the graves of the dream. For the Jack of the Olympus era, the world is the testing of the identity resolve. You realize that the world is trying to stop your heart. The lore suggests that Jack is the soldier who refuses to die. You are the only mind that sees the Tenenbaum as a mother of the hope through the gold of the Mercury suites. The penthouse is not a home, it is a mechanical target that you must assault with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the injecting of the Lot 192 so painful. You are fighting the static to regain the will. You look at the paintings of the Ryan, knowing that they are the only ghosts that the Fontaine has left to mock the history. The Golden Age is a pulse in the chest, and you are the only will left to rhythmize the revenge of the Rapture. As the seventh segment of the history concludes, Jack stands in the dressing rooms of the Proving Grounds, the suit of the Big Daddy waiting for the final weld. Behind lies the decadent sovereignty of the elite and the sabotage of the heart. Before stands the protection of the little sisters and the final duel with the transformed Fontaine. The air is no longer tense with the static, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the cold weight of the iron. You have seen the sovereignty of the fallen aristocracy, the bitter cure of the Lot 192, and the sacrifice of the human form. The lore of Bioshock has shifted from the sovereignty of the autonomy to the sovereignty of the protector. You realize that the armor is real. You look at the helmet, knowing that you are finally the only guardian of the future. The Golden Age is a drill in the dark, and you are the only hand left to secure the path for the little sisters. The descent into the Proving Grounds and the final conditioning of the protagonist's body introduces the lore of the somatic sovereignty of the mechanical hybrid. As Jack undergoes the final stages of the Big Daddy transformation, the environment represents the industrial sovereignty of the Point Prometheus. The lore suggests that the Proving Grounds were the training fields for the city's most lethal protectors, a place where the human was systematically replaced by the hardware, representing the biomechanical sovereignty of the Suchong's legacy. For Jack, this mission is the lore of the becoming of the shield. He finds that his senses are now filtered through the portholes of the helmet, and his voice is replaced by the low-frequency groan of the suit. This is the lore of the iron metamorphosis, where the man must sacrifice the flesh to become the guardian, turning the training facilities into a sacrament of the grafting. The escort of the Little Sisters provides the lore of the vulnerable sovereignty of the genetic harvester. Because only the Little Sisters can open the atom-sealed doors leading to Fontaine's hideout, the journey through the proving grounds represents the tactical sovereignty of the escort. The lore suggests that the bond between the Big Daddy and the Little Sister is the only functional relationship left in the sunken city, representing the symbiotic sovereignty of the survival. This is the lore of the walk through the fire. It suggests that protection is the only virtue in a world of the predation. This represents the moral sovereignty of the sentinel. The lore of the Sisters' guidance is the lore of the small hand in the metal, where the child is the key and the monster is the door, proving that your sovereignty is defensive, turning the industrial corridors into a sacrament of the vow. The lore of the Point Prometheus Research District provides the lore of the scientific sovereignty of the genetic forge. This district, the birthplace of every plasmid and every Big Daddy, represents the intellectual sovereignty of the Fontaine futuristics. The lore suggests that Point Prometheus was the brain of the Rapture, where the future of the human race was dissected and reassembled for the profit, representing the capitalist sovereignty of the evolution. This is the lore of the factory of the gods. It suggests that God is a formula that can be mass-produced. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the laboratory. The lore of the district exploration is the lore of the ghost of the progress, where the miracle is exposed as a horror, turning the splicing vats into a sacrament of the desecration. The final preparation for the final duel introduces the lore of the resourceful sovereignty of the arsenal accumulation. As Jack gathers the remaining tonic slots and weapon upgrades within the Prometheus labs, the environment represents the technical sovereignty of the peak mutation. The lore suggests that Jack is now the most advanced life form in the history of the city, a perfect storm of the plasmids and the armor, representing the evolutionary sovereignty of the combat. This is the lore of the peak of the chain. It suggests that Ryan's son has surpassed the father through the Fontaine science. This represents the aggressive sovereignty of the climax. The lore of the final upgrade is the lore of the sharpening of the blade. It prepares the protagonist for the god-killing, proving that your sovereignty is absolute. The lore of the candidate induction and the Big Daddy voices provides the lore of the psychological sovereignty of the muted identity. The process of modifying the vocal cords to produce the whale-like moans of the Big Daddies represents the sociological sovereignty of the erasure. The lore suggests that Rapture required its protectors to be non-verbal to prevent them from questioning the orders, representing the totalitarian sovereignty of the utility. This is the lore of the silent sentry. It suggests that communication is irrelevant to the violence. This represents the biological sovereignty of the compliance. The lore of the voice box modification is the lore of the loss of the speech. It mutes the Jack to speak the language of the machine, turning the medical operating tables into a sacrament of the isolation. The presence of the feral splicers and the total collapse introduces the lore of the anarchic sovereignty of the final days. As Jack moves through the final zones, the splicers he encounters are no longer humanoid in their behavior, but purely animalistic, representing the nihilistic sovereignty of the oversplicing. The lore suggests that Rapture has eaten itself, and the citizens are now carrion for the parasites, representing the ecological sovereignty of the decay. This is the lore of the death of the society. It suggests that objectivism has dissolved into the chaos of the hunger. This represents the political sovereignty of the void. The lore of the final splicer wave is the lore of the last breath of the city, turning the Prometheus plazas into a sacrament of the apocalypse. For the Jack of the Prometheus era, the world is the testing of the physical resolve. You realize that the world is now seen through a yellow lens. The lore suggests that Jack is the machine with a human heart. You are the only mind that understands the duty of the protector through the steel of the helmet. The proving grounds are not a training camp, It is a mechanical purgatory that you must exit with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the escorting of the child so heavy. You are becoming the thing you feared to kill the man you hate. You look at the drill on your arm, knowing that it is the only hand that the history has left to tear down the fontaine. The golden age is a low-frequency hum, and you are the only will left to vibrate the end of the Frank fontaine. As this 8th segment of the history concludes, Jack stands at the elevator to the final confrontation, the little sisters pointing toward the heaven of the fontaine. Behind lies the sovereignty of the mechanical hybrid and the sacrifice of the human voice. Before stands the battle with the great beast and the ascension of the final boss. The air is no longer tense with the escort, but heavy with the smell of the ozone and the imminent deicide. You have seen the sovereignty of the genetic forge, the loss of the self, and the collapse of the society. The lore of Bioshock has shifted from the sovereignty of the protector to the sovereignty of the reckoning. You realize that the elevator is real. You look at the top floor, knowing that you are finally the only executioner of the sea. The golden age is a whirring of the drill, and you are the only hand left to bore a hole into the heart of the Frank fontaine. The confrontation at the Point Prometheus helipad and the final breach into the heart of the city's elevator systems introduces the lore of the apotheosis of the scavenger. As Jack reaches the summit of the industrial district, the environment represents the theological sovereignty of the genetic ascension. The lore suggests that the final arena is not a battlefield, but a temple of the atom, where the great chain is finally snapped by the weight of the pure greed, representing the nihilistic sovereignty of the Frank fontaine. For Jack, this mission is the lore of the deicide of the deep. He finds that the man he sought to kill has been erased by the substance, replaced by a monster of the elemental power. This is the lore of the end of the human era, where the slave must execute the god to reclaim the life, turning the helipad platform into a sacrament of the final extraction. The final duel with Frank fontaine provides the lore of the unstable sovereignty of the plasmid overload. Fontaine, having injected himself with massive quantities of atom, transforms into a genetic giant capable of channeling fire, ice, and electricity, representing the chemical sovereignty of the infinite mutation. The lore suggests that Fontaine is no longer a man, but a living reservoir of the DNA, representing the destructive sovereignty of the splicing. This is the lore of the Titan of the Tides. It suggests that power without humanity is a meltdown of the spirit. This represents the evolutionary sovereignty of the failure. The lore of the Fontaine fight is the lore of the draining of the blood, where the god is sapped of his strength by the needles of the innocents, proving that your sovereignty is kinetic and vengeful, turning the ascension chamber into a sacrament of the desperation. The intervention of the Little Sisters provides the lore of the retributive sovereignty of the small hands. In the final moments of the duel, the Little Sisters, whom Jack has protected, swarm the fallen Fontaine to deliver the killing blow with their atom-extracting needles, representing the biological sovereignty of the Justice. The lore suggests that the tools of the gathering have become the instruments of the execution, representing the moral sovereignty of the reversal. This is the lore of the death by 1,000 stings. It suggests that the future, the children, has rejected the past, the con artist. This represents the poetic sovereignty of the redemption. The lore of the Fontaine's end is the lore of the return to the silt, where the tyrant is consumed by his own harvest, turning the final arena into a sacrament of the finality. The ascension to the surface introduces the lore of the atmospheric sovereignty of the freedom. As Jack and the surviving Little Sisters enter the final bathysphere to escape the crumbling city, the environment represents the navigational sovereignty of the survival. The lore suggests that Rapture is finally letting go of its prisoners, representing the geographic sovereignty of the exit. This is the lore of the breaking of the surface. It suggests that the sun is a reward for surviving the dark. This represents the psychological sovereignty of the release. The lore of the final ascent is the lore of the silence of the pressure. It marks the end of the sunken utopia, proving that your sovereignty is transcendental, turning the icy Atlantic waters into a sacrament of the rebirth. The resolution of the little sister's fate provides the lore of the compassionate sovereignty of the new life. Depending on the player's choices throughout the journey, the lore branches into the dual sovereignty of the legacy. In the good ending, Jack brings the children to the surface and raises them as his own daughters, representing the paternal sovereignty of the love. The lore suggests that the man who was born in a lab has earned a family through mercy, representing the sociological sovereignty of the healing. This is the lore of the sun on the skin. It suggests that redemption is possible even in the wake of the madness. This represents the moral sovereignty of the hope. The lore of the final scene is the lore of the old hands holding the new, turning the surface world into a sacrament of the peace. The lore of the Tenenbaum's witness provides the lore of the historical sovereignty of the documentation. As Tenenbaum watches the bathysphere depart, the lore reveals the burden of the survivor, representing the intellectual sovereignty of the witness. The lore suggests that Tenenbaum remains the only link between the horror of the past and the hope of the future, representing the scientific sovereignty of the preservation. This is the lore of the keeper of the sins. It suggests that history must be remembered to prevent the repeat. This represents the philosophical sovereignty of the truth. The lore of the closing narration is the lore of the voice of the remorse, proving that your sovereignty is narrated by the wisdom, turning the ruins of the lighthouse into a sacrament of the epilogue. For the Jack of the final era, the world is the testing of the spiritual resolve. You realize that the world is now yours to shape without the trigger. The lore suggests that Jack is the father who was never a child. You are the only mind that sees the surface as a sanctuary through the blood of the Frank Fontaine. The surface is not a wilderness. It is a sacrament of the normalcy that you must embrace with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the holding of the child's hand so sacred. You are leaving the machine to become the man. You look at the horizon, knowing that it is the only light that the history has left to wash the salt from your eyes. The golden age is a warm breeze on the Atlantic, and you are the only will left to govern the peace of the little sisters. As this ninth segment of the history concludes, Jack stands on the deck of a rescue ship, the Rapture buried fathoms below. Behind lies the duel with the great beast and the ascension of the Freedom. Before stands the legacy of the Rapture and the status of the city in the Bioshock 2 era. The air is no longer tense with the ozone, but heavy with the smell of the sea spray and the sweet reality of the choice. You have seen the sovereignty of the ascension, the death of the tyrant, and the redemption of the genetic slave. The lore of Bioshock has shifted from the sovereignty of the autonomy to the sovereignty of the legacy. You realize that the great chain is buried. You look at the sun, knowing that you are finally the only hero of the abyss. The golden age is a life lived well, and you are the only hand left to write the final chapter of the Rapture's end. The aftermath of the Rapture Civil War and the eventual fading of the city into a ghost of the Atlantic introduces the lore of the entombed sovereignty of the sunken ideology. As the echoes of the atom-induced madness settle into the silt, the environment represents the archaeological sovereignty of the failed utopia. The lore suggests that Rapture did not die because of the ocean, but because of the weight of the human ego, representing the existential sovereignty of the ruin. For the survivors and the world above, this legacy is the lore of the secret in the deep. They find that the great chain has become an anchor of the history, dragging the dreams of the 1940s into the darkness of the 1960s. This is the lore of the drowning of the objectivism, where the city becomes the sacrament of the warning, turning the Atlantic Trench into a casket of the radical individuality. The cultural impact of the atom outbreak provides the lore of the molecular sovereignty of the global threat. Even as Jack escapes, the knowledge of the gene remains a phantom in the scientific world, representing the invasive sovereignty of the genetic mutation. The lore suggests that Adam was the forbidden fruit of the 20th century, a substance that promised godhood but delivered deformity, representing the biological sovereignty of the corruption. This is the lore of the scars of the splicing. It suggests that evolution is a weapon that cannot be uninvented. This represents the technological sovereignty of the regret. The lore of the post-rapture world is the lore of the silent pandemic, where the gift is feared by the wise, proving that your sovereignty is infectious, turning the medical journals into a sacrament of the terror. The connection to the Bioshock 2 era provides the lore of the cyclic sovereignty of the new management. 10 years after Jack's departure, the rise of Sophia Lamb and the Rapture family represents the collectivist sovereignty of the counter-ideology. The lore suggests that where Ryan preached the I, Lamb preaches the we, using the same genetic tools to create a new type of slavery, representing the sociological sovereignty of the altruism. This is the lore of the rebirth of the nightmare. It suggests that rapture is a disease that merely changes its symptoms. This represents the political sovereignty of the pendulum. The lore of the Big Sister initiation is the lore of the return of the harvest, where the protector is evolved for the hunt, turning the sinking city into a sacrament of the persistence. The connections to the Bioshock Infinite Universe introduces the lore of the transdimensional sovereignty of the lighthouse. The revelation of constant variables across different realities. A man, a city, a lighthouse represents the temporal sovereignty of the Lutece physics. The lore suggests that Rapture and Columbia are mirror images of the same human hubris, representing the metaphysical sovereignty of the multiverse. This is the lore of the circle of the failure. It suggests that choice is subject to the constants of the fate. This represents the cosmological sovereignty of the Elizabeth. The lore of the Sea of the Doors is the lore of the infinite loop, where the lighthouse is the beginning and the end, proving that your sovereignty is universal and unavoidable. The lore of the perpetual leak and the sea's reclamation provides the lore of the elemental sovereignty of the deep pressure. As the glass tunnels finally shatter under the weight of the Atlantic, the lore reveals the end of the architecture, representing the physical sovereignty of the ocean. The lore suggests that nature always wins the argument against the steel, representing the geological sovereignty of the erasure. This is the lore of the burial in the brine. It suggests that utopia is a bubble that must pop. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the gravity. The lore of the final collapse is the lore of the washing away of the sin. It cleanses the metal with the cold and the dark, proving that your sovereignty is temporary, turning the grand atrium into a sacrament of the reef. The status of Jack and the legacy of the Reclaimer provides the lore of the mythological sovereignty of the Ghost Child. In the history of the surface world, Jack remains a mystery, a man with no birth certificate and no grave, representing the existential sovereignty of the legend. The lore suggests that Jack was the only success of the Rapture experiment, a man who learned to be human in a world of the monsters, representing the moral sovereignty of the evolution. This is the lore of the man who broke the chain. It suggests that will is forged in the choice, not the DNA. This represents the philosophical sovereignty of the triumph. The lore of Jack's quiet life is the lore of the victory over the origin, turning the suburban home into a sacrament of the peace, where the warrior is finally the father. For the historian of the Rapture era, the world is the testing of the intellectual resolve. You realize that the world is now a ghost story told in the Atlantic. The lore suggests that Rapture is the tomb of the 20th century. You are the only mind that sees the Andrew Ryan as a warning through the gold of the propaganda. The city is not a wonder. It is a mechanical monument to the arrogance that you must study with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the analysis of the atom so grim. You are reading the debris to understand the fall. You look at the lighthouse, knowing that it is the only finger that the history has left to point at the stars. The golden age is a rust on the pipe, and you are the only will left to catalog the death of the objectivism. As this 10th and final segment of the history concludes, the city of Rapture sits silent and dark beneath the waves. Behind lies the legacy of the failed utopia and the redemption of the genetic slave. Before stands the mystery of the next lighthouse and the infinite possibilities of the tier. The air is no longer tense with the splicing, but heavy with the smell of the sea salt and the weight of the absolute silence. You have seen the sovereignty of the great chain, the deicide of the deep, and the constants of the multiverse. The lore of Bioshock has shifted from the sovereignty of the legacy to the sovereignty of the myth. You realize that the lighthouse is always there. You look at the horizon, knowing that you are finally the only keeper of the sunken truth. The Golden Age is a memory of the neon, and you are the only hand left to close the book on the Rapture's dream.
I had you built! I sent you topside! I called you back, showed you what you was capable of! Even that life you thought you had, that was something I dreamed up and had tattooed inside your head! Now if you don't call that family, I don't know what is! And now...
They offered you this city. And you refused it. And what did you do instead? What I've come to expect of you. You saved them. You gave them the one thing that was stolen from them. A chance. A chance to learn. To find love. To live. And in the end, what was your reward? You never said. But I think I know. A family.